A mask that smiles without a soul. Holmes called it his strangest case. Welcome to Detective Noir. I am your host, Daniel Mercer. I love seeing this community grow. Share where you're tuning in from. Your comments make this journey unforgettable. Now, the story begins. It was one of those autumn afternoons when London seems to lean closer to its own pavements, the sky lowered by a sullen lid of cloud, and the air tinted faintly brown with the industry of a million chimneys. I had been detained with a patient in Marylebone and came at last to Baker Street, with a mind already warmed by anticipation, for I had that morning received a brief note from Holmes, no more than a line asking whether I might look in after 2, with a dot under the word might that I had long ago learned to interpret as an invitation not to be declined. I found my friend in his armchair, legs thrust toward the blaze, his long nervous fingers steepled so that the skeletal delicacy of them was emphasized by the fire's glow. On the table to his right was a litter of paraphernalia, a dissected clockwork toy bird, a curl of fine brass wire like a fallen hair, and a miniature lens such as a watchmaker might favor. His gaze, abstracted and as remote as if fixed upon some point on the far wall of his own mind, flicked up as I entered, and he smiled the barest trifle. "You have been kept waiting," he observed. "Your left cuff is damp at the edge, but not rain soapsuds. You leaned to steady an anxious woman while she washed a child's face, and you did not remove your cufflink for fear of making her feel clumsy. The child is left-handed. The smear is on your right sleeve." I set down my hat with a laugh. "Your compassion does you credit," I returned. "But you are a trifle out. It was the child's grandmother, and I steadied the basin, not her person. As for the left-handedness, that is your usual witchcraft. Not witchcraft, Watson. The oval of foam is higher on the right, and where it breaks there is a little spur where the child's hand would have found its way through." He made a slight deprecating motion. "If one cannot infer such trifles, one has no business with larger ones." Before I could reply, there came the brisk rap of knuckles on the door and Mrs. Hudson's step, followed by her discreet cough. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says he is pressed, and by the look of him I'd believe it." The visitor entered in a gust of damp wool and agitation. He was a tall, spare man, perhaps 50, with the sort of handsome severity one associates with the old Anglican clergy, though his clothes were of the very first cut, and his bearing that of those accustomed to being deferred to. His cheeks were flushed. A quick, intelligent anguish lit his eyes. He held his hat as though it might bite. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" "I am Lionel Charrington. Sir Lionel, if form must intrude, but pray, form is the last luxury I possess this hour." Holmes indicated the chair opposite and regarded him with the tranquil attention that is itself a species of mercy. "The last luxury, you say? Then we shall economize everywhere but in attention. Pray be seated. You have come to us from the riverside, and not in your own carriage. You left it in Whitehall Yard. No, do not start. The clay upon your heel is particular, and you have snuffed a candle in haste within the last half-hour." Charrington stared, as so many have before him, with that mingling of incredulity and desperate hope which is the tribute my friend's peculiar power exacted. He sank into the chair, and the hat fell unregarded to his knee. "It is my niece, Mr. Holmes," he said in a low voice. "My brother's child, Miss Ada Penrith. She is—" He swallowed, and I saw the fingers tighten on the brim. "She is the ward of my house since my brother's passing these 3 years. This morning in the private gallery at Charrington House, my nephew by marriage and I found, God help me, the mask smiling." Holmes made no exclamation. His eyelids lowered a hairbreadth. He drew the brass wire idly through his fingers, as if to thread the man's words upon it. "The mask, Sir Lionel." He nodded sharply. "An antique, part of a small collection that has been in our family since the last century. Funerary objects, minor Roman bronzes, some little Greek terracottas. The mask is the strangest of them, a plaster cast with a coat of wax, a thing from Magna Graecia, the catalogue says, a face with a calm mouth, or had until last night. This morning it smiled, and in the same room he broke off, and when he continued, it was with the dreadful flatness of one who relates facts in order not to feel them. Mr. Julian Mortlake was found lying just beneath it, dead upon the parquet. No wound, no sign of struggle. The police can make nothing of it. They propose a seizure of the heart, a disorder of the nerves. But the mask, Mr. Holmes, the mouth is different. It is impossible, and yet it is. And my niece, Holmes lifted a hand. Your niece discovered the body? No, she was found in the corridor, unwell. It appears she had gone to the gallery at an early hour to see a letter. He checked himself. And she is not in a condition to be questioned with any harshness. Mr. Mortlake had been, paying his addresses. He was in the house by my permission, having stayed after a musicale last evening to examine the bronzes. He has a taste for such things. Had, I should say. Charrington's mouth twisted. It is monstrous to speak of him like a parcel already delivered, but what is life if not a brutal counting? Holmes leaned forward, and the languor that sometimes sat upon him like a cloak lifted as if tossed aside. Did anyone else go to the gallery between midnight and morning? Our footman reports that the house slept. The doors were made fast. The area gate was locked. Mr. Mortlake, to my shame, possessed a latchkey by my indulgence. However, he was already in the house. The servants heard a clock at 5, and then voices in the corridor at past. My niece's maid found her faint. The butler, who ran to fetch water, saw Mortlake upon the floor and the mask, smiling. I have put the room under seal. Inspector Lestrade was summoned. He has requested that I take care, for there may be talk. The mask is known. There has been a small paragraph in the morning's gossip. A miracle in Mayfair. Holmes's eyes brightened at that word, as steel brightens to a spark. Miracles are merely crimes with better press agents, he murmured. Tell me of Mr. Mortlake, a barrister, talented, ambitious, popular with ladies and newspapers. 32, perhaps. There is a certain bravado in him, but he was clever. He sought Ada's hand with an ardor that pleased my sister-in-law and troubled me. He is or was also in debt to a woman I would not willingly have within my doors. Your candour is a benefaction, said Holmes. You spoke of a letter. Charrington's gaze flickered. There was a piece of correspondence Miss Penrith expected this morning, and she feared its delay. She may have gone to the gallery to distract herself. You will forgive me if I am circumspect in my niece's affairs. Holmes inclined his head, as though acknowledging a fair thrust in a game of chess. You mentioned snuffing a candle in haste, Sir Lionel. Pray, why? Charrington blinked. When Lestrade had finished, I sent for my carriage and then dismissed it. I could not sit still. I walked as far as the Embankment and went into St. Stephen's to pray. The verger was putting out candles. I assisted him, perhaps without permission. He smiled wanly. I am not a devout man, Mr. Holmes, but I am a desperate one. Holmes rose. We shall go to Charrington House at once, if we are welcome. Watson, your hat. Sir Lionel, give me 10 minutes to make a small preparation. Mrs. Hudson, if the cab should call, tell the man we are descending. Even in such moments, Holmes could not forego his small economies. He placed the coil of wire and the toy bird's gear into his pocket, as though these trifles, which had occupied him at leisure, might refuse to be left behind. He took up his glass, which he calls with affectionate irony his ocular conscience, and slipped it into his breast. As we jolted through the crowded arteries of the city, Charrington spoke little, and that little only to answer Holmes's pointed and seemingly wayward questions. Had Mr. Mortlake enemies? Which of the servants had a head for locks? Did the house keep beeswax or tallow for its winter draught stoppers? Was there any scent, any peculiar odour about the gallery? To that last Charrington frowned. Now that you ask, there was a faint sweetness when I entered, as if someone had broken a perfumed pomander long ago, and the ghost of it remained. My sister-in-law remarked upon it. But the window was latched. We do not allow open sashes in the gallery for fear of soot on the statuary. When we turned from Oxford Street into the grander, quieter squares, the traffic thinned to the whisper of wheels upon wet stone and the occasional cry of a costermonger. Charrington House stood in the centre of a line of town mansions, its facade an essay in restrained wealth. Within, the carpets muffled our steps, and the butler, a grave pillar of a man with eyebrows like delicate awnings, received us with that mixture of deference and alarm which a household offers to the physician come to bleed the house, or to Holmes come to dissect its secrets. Inspector Lestrade was waiting in the anteroom to the gallery, hands in his pockets, gaze as sharp as a terrier's and perhaps twice as suspicious. Ah, Mr. Holmes, I had a feeling I'd find you sniffing around the furniture. He nodded to me with a curt friendliness. Doctor, you come in time to admire a curiosity. If smiling masks are to become the fashion, I suppose we must all accustom ourselves to the expression. Holmes passed him with a brief word and that courteous inattention which is far from discourtesy. It is the tribute one violinist pays another when the score demands concentration over camaraderie. He paused on the threshold and took one long breath, as a diver does before cold water. The private gallery was a rectangular chamber lined with cabinets and pedestals. The light came from a glazed roof far above, dimmed now by the sulking afternoon, and fell in a cool wash upon the objects arranged with the kind of care that speaks of family pride rather than acquisitive appetite. On the far wall hung the mask. It was larger than I expected, the pale face of a person neither young nor old, with that Grecian serenity which can look like pity when the light is kind and like judgment when it is not. And yet, here I confess my heart stumbled. It smiled. It was no vulgar grin, no grotesque caricature of mirth, but a small, unmistakable lift at the corner of the mouth, as if some thought had just occurred to it and would not be shared. Beneath it, within the neat ellipse of a chalked outline, lay the mark of where a man had fallen. The parquet was unscuffed. There were no shards, no displaced fragments. Only at the very edge of the chalked line, a half-moon smear the color of watered wine. Holmes went down upon one knee with a cat's fluid ease. He did not touch the smear. He breathed upon it gently and watched. He examined the skirting, the picture cord, the window latch, the faintest seam of draught along the sill, for he held a wisp of ash there, and it trembled in a direction contrary to the expected. He looked up at the mask a long time without moving, so still that for a moment I felt absurdly that both man and object were engaged in a species of contest, each waiting for the other to betray an intention. "Do you observe, Watson," he said at last very softly, "that the smile is not symmetrical? The right corner is a trifle higher than the left. That is not Greek, that is recent," Lestrade snorted. "A trick of the light, Mr. Holmes. My man at the yard says these old things warp and settle. No doubt your man is a philosopher." Holmes's tone was mild. "Tell me, Inspector, did anyone handle the mask?" "No one with my permission." The house was shut. I had the room cordoned. "We've had a constable on the door." Holmes nodded and then quite suddenly smiled himself, a quick private gleam that I knew well. He extracted from his pocket the coil of fine brass wire and the tiny gear of the toy bird. "Forgive me a child's experiment," he murmured. "And now, Sir Lionel, if I may trouble you for a ladder, and for the name of every person who had cause last night to wish Mr. Julian Mortlake either joy or ruin." The ladder arrived with the quiet haste of a well-run house, the butler directing a footman, as if setting a small piece of stage machinery into place. Holmes tested the rungs with a palm and then, with that feline lightness which always surprises those who forget how spare he is, ascended until his eye was level with the mask's waxen cheek. He did not touch it at once. He held the tiny gear and the coil of brass wire against the picture rail, as a jeweler sets a stone by the light. His head tipped, his breath held to avoid even that disturbance. I saw his left hand hover, then drop. He looked past the mask along the taut line of cord to the nail sunk in the moulding, and there his gaze paused. "Do you mark it, Watson?" he said without turning. "The faint bloom upon the cord. New fibre and a trace, no, that is interesting, of something greasy. Not furniture polish. A lighter oil with a ghost of scent." Lestrade, who had arranged his features into a politeness that would not quite keep the impatience from biting at its edges, shifted on his heels. "This is all very diverting, Mr. Holmes, but my superintendent will not be persuaded to prosecute a jar of pomatum." Holmes ignored him. From his waistcoat, he drew a card of pins and took one, sliding it beneath the knot where cord met hook. He withdrew it and held it, so the high light struck the pin's point. A tenderness of dark upon the steel. He touched it to his tongue and smiled very slightly. "Not dust, a syrup. The sweetness noted by Sir Lionel is not from the air, but from a thing having once flowed." He descended as smoothly as he had gone up, and knelt again within the ellipse upon the floor. "You observed, Watson, the half-moon stain." He produced from another pocket a slip of white paper, and with infinite care touched it to the edge of the smear. It took the faintest colour. He held it open between finger and thumb, and watched for the slow transparency that oil yields. None came. He sniffed it, and his nostrils scarcely moved. "Grenadine," he murmured, "or a cordial of pomegranate." One of those sugared essences ladies are advised for the throat. It has dried to a glaze where the heel of a shoe caught it. A lady stood very near this place after the fall. Not our victim. He used tobacco of a virile sort and left none of it here. Sir Lionel's mouth tightened. My sister-in-law and niece do not... Holmes raised a palm and the baronet stopped, breath held. We shall accuse no one until accusation is the only economy left to us. You will oblige me with names, however, for knowledge is a currency that appreciates those who would have wished Mr. Mortlake joy or ruin last night. Sir Lionel looked to the butler, as if to consult the ledger of his household before he consulted his own mind. There is my sister-in-law, Lady Eugenia Penrith. She favoured Mr. Mortlake's suit. There is Mr. Frederick Vale, my nephew by marriage, who admires my niece in his clumsy way and holds an ill opinion of barristers in debt. There is Miss Ada's maid, Rose Mabbott, the footman Pritchard, who has a talent for locks and too little sense for discretion. Among those not of the house there is Mrs. Temple Black, a person of means who extends them to young men upon terms I do not care for. It is she to whom Mortlake was indebted. There is also Mr. Silas Quayle, a rival collector who dined with us and left early and sour. It is a garden of motives, said Holmes softly, the thorns very prettily concealed among the blooms. We shall pluck with care. He turned to Lestrade. You have the body? At St. Bartholomew's. The surgeon notes no mark and no poison he can name. The heart is as sound as a church bell, which is more than can be said for my patients, Mr. Holmes. We shall look in upon him after our harvest here, Holmes returned unruffled. In the interval, I would speak to Miss Penrith only if her physician approves it, and to her maid in any case. Also to the footman, Pritchard, and the butler, whose eyebrows convey more than many men's mouths. The butler bore this compliment without visible pleasure. If you please, sir, Miss Mabbott waits below. She came with that country brightness which London polishes without ever quite removing. A young woman with a straightforward brow and a thumb stained faintly with violet. She curtsied to Sir Lionel, bobbed to Lestrade, and looked at Holmes as if he were a physician called in for a delicate extraction. You found your mistress in the corridor? Holmes asked, and at once his voice altered by a hair's warmth. The instrument tuned for a softer chamber. Yes, sir. At 5:30 by the clock. She had on her morning wrapper and was pale as linen. I fetched water and sent for Mr. Jevons, the butler. Then Mr. Vale came running and, here the girl's lip twitched, he was very put about. I brought my mistress to her room and made her easy as I could. Why was your thumb in the service of violet this morning, Miss Mabbott? She started and then looked at her hand as if surprised by its own candour. The letter, sir. Her ladyship keeps a little stick of violet sealing wax. I had a bit of it on me. Miss had been waiting on a letter, and I was to carry any that came. Only there was none yet. Holmes did not glance at Sir Lionel, yet I felt a small current pass between them. You were in the gallery earlier? No, sir. I never go there but to dust the cases on a Friday, and today is Wednesday. You know Mr. Mortlake? Only to pass the time of day. He was always kind-spoken to the servants, in that way that makes a girl feel seen and not in a manner she likes. Holmes nodded once, as if a line in a score had resolved as expected. That is very helpful, Miss Mabbott. If presently you would show me to your mistress's door, and after to Mr. Vale, I shall be obliged. I shall be obliged. The girl withdrew. Holmes stood a moment very still, and I could almost hear the cards in his mind arranging themselves into some new pattern. He returned to the wall but not to the mask. Instead, he went to the skirting by the window and pressed a knuckle to the panel. A hollow returned his pressure with a small complaint. There is air here, he said, where there should be none. The ash trembled earlier towards the left, while the window urged to the right. Somewhere a draught runs like a wire drawn through a narrow tube. He put his face close, took a breath, and smiled without mirth. Bergamot, we are in the company of someone's toilet water, and recently, Lestrade grunted. London is in the company of someone's toilet water before breakfast. It is no felony to smell agreeable. No, it is only inconvenient when one means to pass for invisible. Holmes turned back to Sir Lionel. Pray have the ladder taken down and the room left as I found it. I shall need a quarter-hour alone with your butler and his keys, and then, with your leave, a word with Mr. Vale. After that, Watson, we shall pay our respects to Mr. Mortlake at St. Bartholomew's. Before nightfall, I think the mask may yet do us another little favour and tell us who taught it to smile. Holmes's request for a quarter-hour. alone with the butler, was granted with the quiet reluctance of a man unused to, seeing his household placed under a stranger's scrutiny. Sir Lionel withdrew with Lestrade, the latter muttering something about wild goose chases, while Holmes and I remained in the gallery with Mr. Jevons, who carried a neat bunch of keys upon a ring that looked as weighty as a minor chalice. Holmes's first questions seemed almost frivolous. How often the gallery was cleaned, whether the wax on the floor had been freshened lately, and what arrangements were made for lamps in the evenings. Yet with each answer, Jevons's slow, measured tones added another thread to Holmes's tapestry. The floors had been waxed 2 nights before. Lamps were forbidden save at soirees for fear of smoke, so candles were used at a distance and snuffed quickly. No one but himself and Pritchard, the footman, possessed keys to the gallery doors. Holmes extended a hand for the ring and weighed it lightly before selecting the gallery key. He turned it in the lock, withdrew it and examined the wards with a glass. From his pocket he drew the coil of brass wire I had seen earlier, and with 2 deft motions he shaped it into a makeshift pick. He inserted it into the lock, and to my astonishment, the mechanism yielded in less than a breath. "It is an amiable lock," he remarked, returning the keys to Jevons. "It will keep out honesty, but yield to ingenuity. You have cause to watch your footman more closely than your visitors. Mr. Jevons, locks of this simplicity invite practice." The butler inclined his head with dignity, though I could see the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth. "If Mr. Pritchard has indulged in such, sir, he will find it ill-rewarded when I come to know of it." Holmes dismissed him with a nod, and when he was gone, turned to me with an energy I had seen quicken in him at the scent of the chase. "Observe, Watson, the lock is laughable. The panel beneath the window gives air where none should. A lady's cordial is spilt at the very spot our victim fell, and the mask smiles with an expression which is recent and deliberate. What we have here is not the visitation of spirits but of men, or of one man and one woman, if I may be so crude." Before I could reply, the door opened and Frederick Vale entered. He was a broad-shouldered young man, with the easy swagger of one who has never had cause to doubt his place in the world. His hair was arranged with more care than taste, and there was a restlessness in his eyes that spoke of late nights and quick tempers. Holmes greeted him with a politeness that seemed almost detached. "Mr. Vale, I am told you were among the first to come upon your cousin this morning." "I was," Vale replied curtly. "Poor Ada was nearly collapsed, and Mortlake—" He gave a shrug that was meant to convey a manly composure, but failed. "Dead as Caesar." "I had no love for him, Mr. Holmes, but I had no wish for him to end so, and yet you quarrelled with him last night." Vale's face darkened. "That is between us. He had a manner I disliked, and I told him so." He laughed. That was all. Holmes's gaze lingered on him with the soft persistence of rain upon a window. "You wear scent, Mr. Vale?" The young man flushed. "A dash, perhaps. Nothing effeminate. Why?" "Because the gallery, where no scent should be, was redolent of bergamot this morning. And you stand before me with a neckcloth that bears the faintest trace of it still." Vale's hand went instinctively to his collar, then dropped. "Are you suggesting—" He broke off, glaring. "I came when I heard the commotion. That is all. You may ask the servants if I was not in my rooms when the house slept." Holmes inclined his head as though in acceptance. Yet I knew from the glint in his eye that Vale had added himself to the inner circle of suspicion. When the young man withdrew, stiff-backed and bristling, Holmes turned to me. "A rash temperament, Watson, and rash temperaments leave ragged seams in the neat fabric of crime." We left the gallery soon after, Holmes requesting of Sir Lionel that the room remain sealed until further notice. Then we set out for St. Bartholomew's, the cab rocking us through the wet London streets. Holmes was silent for much of the journey, his gaze fixed on some abstraction only he could see. At last he spoke. "Mortlake's death bears the mark of contrivance, not seizure. The absence of wounds, the presence of cordial, the smiling mask, all are notes in a composition too elaborate for chance. The question is not whether he was murdered, but by what instrument and whose hand. At the hospital the body awaited us in a chill chamber. Mortlake lay with the piece of marble, his features fine and untroubled, the lips faintly parted as though a word had been taken from him mid-breath. Holmes bent over him, examining the nails, the gums, the whites of the eyes. He produced his glass once more, scrutinizing a small darkening at the edge of the victim's tongue. "Here, Watson, observe. The faintest dusky mark. No surgeon would call it proof, but to me it whispers of a substance employed with subtlety. Not a common poison, no strychnine or prussic acid, but something less familiar." He straightened and looked at me with that quiet fire which told me the game had quickened. "I must consult my books on toxicology." Yet even without the name, the hand is visible. The cordial, the draught behind the panel, the scent of bergamot, all these are threads leading to the same shuttle. "And the mask?" I asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Ah, the mask, Watson. That is the boldest stroke of all. To alter the very countenance of an antique, to make it smile upon the scene of death, that is the touch of an artist or of a madman. Perhaps both. But mark me, the mask did not smile of its own accord. Someone taught it the expression, and in that lesson lies the identity of our culprit. As we left the chamber, I felt the chill of the hospital give way to the heavier damp of the city evening. Holmes walked swiftly, his coat drawn tight, and I matched his stride, knowing by long experience that the case had reached the point where every clue pressed forward, urgent and insistent, toward revelation. We returned from St. Bartholomew's in the thickening fog of an autumn evening, the lamps already burning weakly in the gloom as the hansom cab rattled across Holborn. Holmes had not spoken a word since we left the hospital. His chin was sunk deep into the collar of his ulster, and only the rhythmic flick of his long fingers against his knee betrayed the restless calculation at work within. I knew better than to disturb him when in that condition, but my own thoughts were full of Mortlake's still features and of Holmes's murmured hint of poison. At Baker Street, the warmth of our hearth greeted us, and Holmes flung himself immediately into the litter of books that lay upon the shelf above his chemical table. He drew down one after another, Orfila, Taylor, Christison, and flipped the leaves with a practiced hand. Presently he lit his lamp, prepared a small phial of reagents, and set to work upon the paper bearing the faint stain he had lifted from the parquet of the gallery. I watched as he combined drop with drop until the faint glaze upon the paper deepened to a dusky violet. Holmes leaned back with an expression of sharp satisfaction. "There it is, Watson. Syrup of pomegranate it may be, but adulterated with extract of aconitum, Nepellus, monkshood. Subtle enough that a cordial could disguise it, deadly enough to silence a man with scarcely a convulsion. It leaves but the faintest shadow upon the tongue, and a stillness upon the heart that might deceive any but the most vigilant physician." I stared at the paper in awe. Then Mortlake was murdered beyond question. Precisely. And murdered with deliberation, for aconite is no household remedy. Whoever administered it possessed both access and intent. The cordial is the key, for Mortlake must have imbibed it shortly before his collapse. The smear upon the floor shows that some remnant was spilled in the gallery, perhaps by the hand that carried it. Perhaps by Mortlake himself in his final moment. I ventured that Ada Penrith, poor girl, might have brought such a draught, unaware of its adulteration. Holmes gave me a glance that checked my sympathy. "Possible, Watson, but unlikely. Consider. The cordial was not merely present, but spilt in a place where no refreshment should be. And then the mask. Altered, manipulated, presented as though mocking the very scene. That bespeaks not innocence, but design." He rose and paced before the fire. "We must now unravel how Mortlake came to be in that gallery, with a poisoned cordial, and a mask that smiled upon his death. The servants can be eliminated by common sense. Such an act is beyond their power and motive. The butler and maid supply us with color, but the darker pigment lies elsewhere. Vale reeks of jealousy. Mrs. Temple Black of debt, Sir Lionel of anxious concealment. Each may be shaded by truth, but one hand alone adjusted that mask. The next morning we returned to Charrington House. The fog still clung about the great square, muffling sound, and lending the house the air of a mausoleum. We were admitted by Jevons, who informed us that Miss Penrith was improved and willing to receive us for a few moments. Holmes insisted I accompany him, for as he said, a physician's presence might afford reassurance. Ada Penrith lay upon a chaise in her chamber, a delicate figure with eyes still shadowed from her ordeal. She greeted us with a composure that surprised me, though the tremor in her hands betrayed the effort. Holmes's manner was at its gentlest, for he could temper steel into velvet when it served him. "Miss Penrith," he began, "forgive the intrusion. We desire only to spare you further distress, by resolving this matter quickly. May I ask whether Mr. Mortlake partook of any refreshment in your company last night? Her gaze faltered. There was wine at the musicale, but no more. This morning, she hesitated. I did see him with a small glass. I thought it water. He laughed when I remarked upon his early rising and said he was fortifying himself against the chill. Holmes inclined his head. And did you yourself carry or provide that glass? No, she whispered. I had been waiting for a letter and went to the gallery early, but when I saw him there I fled into the corridor overcome. It was then I fainted. I do not know whence the glass came. Holmes regarded her steadily, then allowed the silence to stretch before he bowed. Your candor is of service, Miss Penrith. Rest assured we shall trouble you no more until the truth is clear. As we left her chamber, Holmes murmured low enough for my ears alone. She speaks truth, Watson. The timbre of a fainting woman cannot counterfeit the harmony of innocence. But her presence at that hour confirms our timeline. Mortlake was in the gallery by 5 with a cordial in hand. Someone placed it there before him. Descending, we encountered Inspector Lestrade, whose expression was half smug triumph, half irritation at our persistence. He informed us that Vale had been seen leaving the house at dawn by a milkman, though he claimed to have only sought fresh air. Lestrade was inclined to seize upon this as proof of guilt. Holmes only smiled faintly. Perhaps you are right, Inspector. Yet guilt seldom parades itself so early in the day. We shall not confine our net too narrowly. Tell me, have you examined the mask itself since yesterday? Lestrade shook his head, declaring it folly. Holmes at once requested its removal to a table, where he bent with his glass. His long fingers traced the edge of the wax coating, pausing at a corner of the mouth. With a delicate motion he prized away a flake of material and revealed beneath a line of recent paint. Behold, Watson, the smile is no miracle of antiquity, but the handiwork of a brush dipped in common pigment. Someone altered the mask deliberately to stage the effect. And see here, the faintest indentation of a thumb at the edge, as though the artist pressed too hard while steadying his hand. Lestrade scoffed that any prankster might be guilty, but Holmes's eyes shone. Not a prankster, Inspector. An artist and artificer. A mind that weaves deceit upon deceit. The poison and the paint are 2 verses of the same song. And when we find who sang it, we shall find who killed Julian Mortlake. With that he gathered his glass, his face alight with the peculiar fervor I had seen before, when the fog of mystery had begun to thin, and the shape of truth emerged like a vessel looming upon the horizon. I knew then that the smiling mask was no idle grotesque, but the very hinge upon which the case would turn. Holmes stood over the mask with an expression I knew well, that of a chess master who has at last glimpsed the sequence of moves leading toward checkmate. His finger rested lightly on the spot where the paint had been pressed too firmly, and his eyes, narrow with concentration, seemed to see not the artifact itself, but the hand that had wielded the brush. Lestrade muttered again of folly, but Holmes was deaf to him. "You see, Watson," he murmured, "it is not merely that the mask was altered, but how. This is no amateur dabbling. The stroke is sure, the pigment finely chosen, the wax disturbed as little as possible. It bespeaks skill, and skill requires both inclination and practice. Who among our circle of suspects possesses such a gift, or at least the vanity of it? I ventured the rival collector Silas Quayle. He would know the properties of plaster and wax." Holmes shook his head. "Quayle is clumsy in his passions. He would smash rather than finesse. No, here is a hand accustomed to delicate work, possibly an illustrator, a copyist, or even an idle dabbler in the arts. Vale, perhaps?" He arranges his cravat as though it were a canvas. Before we could pursue the thought, Sir Lionel entered, his face grave. "Mr. Holmes, I have received a note." He held it out with trembling fingers. It was written in a bold, sweeping hand upon thick cream paper. "Withdraw your inquiries into Mortlake's death, or the mask will smile again, and not upon stone." Holmes's eyes glistened with sudden relish. "A threat, how obliging of them! And the phrase, Watson, observe. Not simply the mask will smile again, but not upon stone. That is the touch of a writer conscious of style. Whoever penned this is no blunt instrument. They are steeped in rhetoric." Sir Lionel was visibly shaken. "Does this mean my niece?" Holmes cut him off with a raised hand. "It means only that the culprit wishes us cowed, and nothing in this world is more certain than that such threats have upon me precisely the opposite effect. Tell me, Sir Lionel, Who knew of my presence here this morning? Only the household and Inspector Lestrade. Then we narrow the field. Holmes folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. I shall examine the ink and paper later. But for now, Watson, let us have a word with this Mr. Quayle. If he has an artist's hand, we shall soon learn it. Silas Quayle was found in a modest lodging off Pall Mall, a cramped room half buried in books and curiosities. He was a thin, nervous man, his fingers stained with ink, his eyes darting like minnows. Holmes questioned him with deceptive mildness, asking after Mortlake, after the Charrington collection, after the mask. "It is a monstrosity," Quayle declared, wringing his hands. "That it should be altered is an abomination. But do not look to me, Mr. Holmes. I would never lay brush upon antiquity. Mortlake was my rival, yes, but he was also a fool. His debts were legion, his taste shallow. That he should perish so theatrically," he shrugged. "It is fitting, but not by my design." Holmes studied him for a long moment. "Your fingers, Mr. Quayle, betray your trade. You write, you annotate, you sketch. Have you not ever turned your skill to more devious uses?" Quayle flushed scarlet. "Never. My pride is my scholarship. If others think me bitter, it is because truth seldom flatters." Holmes left him with a courteous bow, and once outside he muttered, "Not our hand, Watson." The ink betrays more haste than art. Quayle rails, but he does not contrive. We returned to Baker Street as the lamps were lit across the city. Holmes set the threatening note beside the stained paper, and with his glass compared fibers and strokes. The ink of the note bore a faint sheen, as though it had been dried hastily with sand. He rubbed a corner between finger and thumb, and then touched it to his tongue. Gum Arabic, heavy in proportion. This is the hand of one accustomed to correspondence of a fashionable sort, letters that must look as grand as they sound. Lady Eugenia, perhaps? Or Mrs. Temple Black. Both women deal in appearances. At that moment a telegram arrived bearing only these words: "Another has seen the mask smile. Come at once." It was unsigned, but the address was unmistakably Charrington House. Holmes sprang to his feet, his languor vanishing as if it had never been. We hastened there by cab, and upon arrival found the household in agitation. Rose Mabbott, the maid, pale and trembling, declared she had entered the gallery to draw the curtains, and saw the mask grinning wider still, as though its very mouth had stretched. She swore it had changed since the morning. Holmes inspected it with his lens while Lestrade scoffed. After a moment he gave a short, sharp laugh. "The mouth has not moved since my last inspection. What has changed is the light. Someone shifted the curtains to alter the fall of shadow upon the plaster. A trick, Watson, nothing more. But the timing," I said. "The note, the telegram, and now this." "Just so," Holmes replied. "We are being played, and the hand is impatient. They desire us unnerved, but we are not unnerved, are we, Watson? No, we are sharpened. The brush, the poison, the rhetoric of threats, these are the tools of one mind, and I believe that mind sits much closer to Miss Penrith than Sir Lionel dares admit." As we left the gallery, Holmes paused upon the stair and tapped the rail with a long finger. "I have one last thread to tug, Watson, and when it yields we shall see the whole tapestry fall into place. Tonight we watch, for I am convinced our culprit cannot resist returning to admire their handiwork, and admiration is ever the undoing of vanity." That night we remained within the hushed chambers of Charrington House, Holmes having prevailed upon Sir Lionel to grant us free passage. The baronet consented reluctantly, though I detected in his eyes a glimmer of relief, as though he sensed that Holmes was now near to grasping the nettle that had stung his family. The household withdrew early, for the strain of the last days had borne heavily upon them. Only Jevons moved silently through the passages, his lantern dimmed, his tread soft as a shadow. Holmes chose the gallery for our vigil. He had the mask lowered from its wall and replaced upon its hook with his own hands, measuring chords and angles with a meticulousness that spoke of some hidden experiment. He then stationed me behind one of the cabinets, where I might observe the door while he himself took a chair in the corner, the glow of his pipe scarcely visible in the gloom. We spoke little. Hours stretched, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire in some distant room and the dull chime of the great clock below. Near midnight, a faint stir reached my ears, the almost inaudible whisper of a latch lifted with care. I strained my eyes through the dimness and discerned a figure slipping inside. The visitor moved with the stealth of one long accustomed to secrecy, drawing the curtain so as to admit a paler shaft of moonlight through the upper panes. In that faint illumination, I recognized Frederick Vale. His face was pale, his lips tight, and he carried in his hand a small case. He approached the mask with a manner half defiant, half reverent, and from the case withdrew a brush no larger than a pen. I could scarce contain my astonishment, but Holmes lifted a hand, commanding silence. Vale leaned close to the mask, his brush poised to deepen the painted curve of the smile. Before the stroke could fall, Holmes was upon him, his long arm darting like a whip to seize the wrist. "Enough, Mr. Vale. You admire your handiwork too deeply." Vale started as though struck by lightning. His case fell, scattering brushes and a small vial that rolled to rest at my feet. For a moment he struggled, then sagged as though the strength had gone out of him. "You do not understand," he gasped. I only wished to make her see. Holmes released him but stood blocking the door. To make whom see? Ada, always Ada. Mortlake had her ear, her heart, her very future. But he was unworthy, a braggart drowning in debt. I wished to show her what he was, to startle her, to break his hold, by poisoning him. Holmes's tone was quiet but cut like steel. Vale shook his head vehemently. "I never touched him. I only painted the mask. I thought to frighten him, perhaps, to show him that in our house, among our relics, his vanity was dwarfed. He saw me at it last night. He laughed, mocked me, and said he would tell Ada what fool's trick I devised. That is all. When I went to my room, he lived still. Holmes crouched, lifted the fallen vial, and held it to the light. A trace of pigment remained upon the rim. Paint, not poison." He turned the brush over in his fingers, examining the worn bristles. Then he fixed Vale with a gaze that brooked no deceit, and the cordial Mr. Vale. "I know nothing of it, nothing." Holmes regarded him for a long moment, before motioning me to gather the brushes. "We shall test his words, Watson. If this vial holds no more than pigment, then our Mr. Vale is guilty of vanity, of folly, perhaps of cruelty, but not of murder. Yet his intrusion proves one thing beyond cavil. The mask's transformation was no miracle, but the deliberate work of a hand that thrives on drama." Vale sagged into the chair, his defiance crumbling. "Say what you will of me, Holmes, but I swear upon my honor I never sought Mortlake's death. I only sought," he broke off, his eyes filling with a sudden bitterness, "to be seen." Holmes studied him a moment longer, then with a curt nod instructed Jevons, who had crept near at the commotion, to confine Vale to his chamber until morning. When we were alone again, Holmes resumed his seat, his pipe glowing faintly. "So, Watson," he said softly, "the mask is explained. Yet Mortlake lies dead and the poison remains. Vale is our brushman, not our poisoner. The true hand is still at liberty, and it is one that writes as well as it paints." I recalled then the threatening note. The rhetoric, the flourish. "Do you suspect Lady Eugenia?" Holmes's smile was a mere shadow. "Not yet. But I suspect she knows more than she confesses. We shall see." The night wore on without further intrusion, and at last the grey fingers of dawn reached through the high windows. Holmes rose, stretched, and looked upon the mask one final time. "It is always vanity, Watson. Vale's vanity with his brush, Mortlake's vanity with his debts and conquests, and perhaps another's vanity still, hidden behind a cordial sweetened to death. Today we press that vein until it yields. For by tonight, the smiling mask will have its final witness." Morning light seemed to wash the gallery of its menace. Yet the memory of Vale's pale face and desperate confession lingered as we broke our fast with Sir Lionel. Holmes ate sparingly, his thoughts turned inward, while our host pressed food upon us without appetite himself. Lestrade had been summoned and soon arrived, all brisk authority, though his irritation was plain when informed of Vale's nocturnal activities. "So there we have it," he declared, rubbing his hands. The young cockerel thought to make a jest of the mask, frightened the barrister, and when Mortlake mocked him, he took revenge with poison. All very neat. I'll have him brought to the yard within the hour. Holmes, who had been buttering his toast with the abstraction of a man dissecting a sonata in his head, looked up with faint amusement. "Neat, Inspector? I should rather call it ragged." "You credit Vale with artistry of two kinds, when he is guilty only of one." Lestrade scowled. "You've seen him with your own eyes, brush in hand." "Quite so. Brushes, pigment, vanity, that we can prove. But poison, Inspector, is another craft altogether. You forget the cordial. That was no paint pot accident, but a deliberate preparation. Vale was absent from the gallery when Mortlake took it, unless you suppose he contrived to lace it in his chamber and spirit it into Mortlake's hand without leaving his room. We must look elsewhere. Lestrade muttered about theories that led nowhere. But Holmes had already turned to Sir Lionel. I must speak with Lady Eugenia, and at once. She received us in her drawing-room, where the curtains were drawn against the weak morning sun, and a faint perfume lingered, violets and something sharper beneath. She was a handsome woman still, her bearing stately, her eyes watchful. "Mr. Holmes," she said with a composure that did not disguise her dislike of intrusion, "you come, I presume, about poor Julian, about him." "Yes, and about you, Lady Eugenia." "Pray tell me, were you aware of his debts?" She gave a small, disdainful laugh. "Of course, do you suppose women are blind? He borrowed from Temple Black, and from half the town besides. But he was clever, amusing," and her voice faltered briefly. "My daughter adored him." That was enough. Holmes's gaze did not waver. "Enough to give him your protection, perhaps even your purse. Did you ever supply him with those sweet cordials your maid prepares?" At this her head lifted sharply. "Certainly not. Why should I? Because one such cordial bore aconite, and Mortlake drank it in your gallery." For the first time her poise cracked. A flush rose in her cheeks, then drained, leaving her pale. She caught her breath and sank back against the cushions. "You accuse me," she whispered. She whispered. Holmes's voice softened, though it lost none of its clarity. "I accuse you of nothing yet. I merely inquire." The cordial was no accident. It was measured, prepared, and administered. It must have passed through a hand close to him. Lady Eugenia pressed a handkerchief to her lips. "If you mean I wished him dead, you are wrong. I wished him married, to Ada. With him gone, she is left vulnerable, her reputation trembling. Do you think that is what I desired?" Holmes regarded her with a steady patience. "No, Lady Eugenia. I think you desired security, for yourself as much as for your daughter. But Mortlake threatened that security. He held debts, he may have held letters, perhaps of a compromising kind. You feared exposure." She did not answer. Instead, her handkerchief trembled, and for a moment I pitied her. But Holmes, relentless as the tide, pressed on. "Where were you at dawn yesterday?" "In my chamber, of course. Ask my maid. We shall—" When we left her, Holmes spoke low to me. "She is not our poisoner, Watson, though she skirts the shadow. Her fear is genuine, but it is the fear of ruin, not the guilt of murder. Still, her words give us light. Mortlake's death served not Ada, not Vale, not even Sir Lionel. It served the one person to whom his debts were owed most dearly. Mrs. Temple Black," I said, just so. "A woman of means, accustomed to pliant men whose influence is whispered of in every club. If Mortlake could not pay, she might silence him rather than suffer exposure of her dealings. And if she wished to strike terror into the Charrington household, what better than to use their own relics as theatre? That afternoon we called upon her. She lived in a townhouse hung with gaudy art, her figure enveloped in silks that rustled with each movement. Her eyes were shrewd, her smile calculated. She welcomed us with excessive warmth, as though anticipating suspicion. "You come about poor Mr. Mortlake," she cooed. "Tragic, such a handsome boy, though reckless. He owed me, yes, but I never pressed him. I am no usurer, Mr. Holmes." Holmes bowed with exquisite courtesy. "Yet you expected his payment, did you not?" Her smile tightened. "Naturally, and when he could not pay, did you see ruin in his refusal, or opportunity?" At this her eyes flashed. "Be careful, sir. I'm not to be insulted in my own house." Holmes's reply was silken. "I never insult, madam. I observe. You employ bergamot in your scent, do you not?" Her hand moved unconsciously to her throat. "A trifle. Why?" "Because the gallery where Mortlake died was redolent of it." For a moment, silence. Then she laughed, though the sound rang hollow. "A coincidence." Half London smells of bergamot, perhaps. Yet the cordial was not coincidence. It was concocted with aconite, a rare poison, though not rare to those with access to apothecaries and the will to pay. She rose abruptly, her silks hissing, her expression sharp. "Enough! I will answer no more of your insinuations." Holmes inclined his head as though yielding, but as we departed he murmured to me, "She trembles, Watson. Not from outrage, but from recognition. She has touched the poison. The mask was Vale's folly, but the death was hers." Back in the cab, Holmes leaned forward, his eyes blazing. "Tonight we spring the trap. We shall gather them all in the gallery. Sir Lionel, Lady Eugenia, Vale, Temple Black even quailed for completeness. And before that mask, still smiling, we shall strip away every falsehood until the true face stands revealed." Evening drew its veil over London once more, the fog thick about the lamplighters as they made their rounds. At Charrington House the air was heavy with expectation, for word had gone forth that all concerned in the affair should assemble in the gallery. Sir Lionel received us with a grave bow, clearly uneasy at Holmes's insistence upon so theatrical a gathering, yet unable to refuse the authority of his presence. The household and guests alike were summoned. Lady Eugenia, pale and severe; Ada Penrith, one but determined to attend with her mother's arm for support; Frederick Vale, sullen and restless, watched closely by Jevons; Silas Quayle, twitching with curiosity; and Mrs. Temple Black, her silks rustling like whispers in a church. Lestrade hovered near, his notebook ready, as if he expected the net to be thrown upon Vale at any instant. The mask still hung upon its cord, its painted smile unaltered. Yet in the gathering dusk of the chamber, it seemed more sinister than ever. Holmes stood before it, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze sweeping the assembled faces. "We meet here," he began, "because this mask has been made the stage upon which a cruel drama was played. One man is dead, another is accused of folly, and a family trembles under suspicion. It is time the mask smiled no longer." His voice, though low, carried to every corner of the room. He paced slowly, as if delivering a lecture to a class. Julian Mortlake died not of apoplexy nor of accident, but of poison. The cordial he drank contained aconite, a preparation subtle enough to deceive the unwary. That cordial was placed in his path with intent. At the same time, this mask was altered with paint, to lend an air of the supernatural, as if death itself had chosen the moment to mock. Two hands were at work, one vain, the other deadly. All eyes turned instinctively to Vale, who flushed and clenched his fists. Holmes's finger, however, pointed at the mask. "Mr. Vale confessed to us last night. He altered this relic with brush and pigment, intending no more than to humble his rival. His motive was jealousy, his weapon vanity. Yet he is no murderer." The poison came from another hand. Lady Eugenia drew a quick breath. Sir Lionel muttered an oath under his breath. Mrs. Temple Black's smile tightened, though her eyes glittered in the lamplight. Holmes resumed. "Consider the scene. Mortlake, ambitious, reckless, drowning in debt, had secured the affections of Miss Penrith and the favour of Lady Eugenia. Yet behind his handsome front he was beholden to a woman whose wealth propped his extravagance. That woman sat even at this table of suspects, Mrs. Temple Black." She laughed, though uneasily. "A bold claim, Mr. Holmes. Do you accuse every creditor when his debtor dies?" Holmes bowed slightly. "By no means. But only one creditor perfumed herself with bergamot, the very scent that lingered in the gallery, though no lady of the house had been there. Only one could gain by silencing Mortlake when his debts threatened exposure of her trade, and only one had access to rare poisons, bought with coin enough to bribe an apothecary's discretion." Temple Black's face paled beneath her paint. "You cannot prove this." Holmes's hand went to his pocket. "Here, madam, is proof enough for those with eyes." He drew forth the threatening note, and beside it a scrap of blotting paper he had taken from her writing table during our visit. The fibres, the sheen of gum arabic, even the flourish of the final letter are identical. "You wrote to Sir Lionel to warn him off, lest inquiry should unveil your secret. And when the mask was said to have changed again, it was you who urged the maid to draw the curtains, knowing the altered light would deepen the illusion." Lestrade snapped his notebook shut. That will serve well enough in court, but Holmes was not finished. He turned to Ada, whose wide eyes had scarcely left him. "Miss Penrith, you may be certain your honour is untouched. Mortlake's death was not born of your actions. Yet it is to you we owe the clue that unlocked the mystery. You saw him drink from the cordial that morning. Without that, we might still wander in fog." The girl pressed a hand to her lips, tears brimming, while her mother stiffened in silence. Holmes's gaze settled once more upon Mrs. Temple Black. "You sought to frighten the household with a smiling mask, to cloak murder beneath superstition. Yet you forgot that theatre has its critics." The smile was not symmetrical. It betrayed the painter's hand. From that small error the truth unfolded. Temple Black's silks rustled as she rose, her composure fraying. "You clever, meddling man. Do you think I will hang for this while dandies like Mortlake strut free of their obligations? He would have ruined me, laughed at me. Better he lie silent beneath your precious relics." Lestrade stepped forward, snapping the irons upon her wrists before further words could pass. The room exhaled as if released from a held breath. Holmes alone remained calm, his eyes on the mask. It no longer seemed to smile, only to brood in silence, the paint dulled by lamplight. He spoke softly, yet every syllable reached us. Vanity painted its smile, greed sharpened its poison, and pride gave it audience. It is not the mask that mocked us, Watson, but humanity itself. As Temple Black was led away, Sir Lionel sagged into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Ida clung to her mother, who remained cold but trembling. Vale stood apart, shame burning his features. Holmes laid a hand on my arm, and we withdrew quietly, leaving the family to its own shadows. Outside, the fog pressed close once more, the gas lamps glowing like hollow eyes. Holmes drew his coat tighter and lit his pipe. "Another mask, Watson, has been stripped away. It will not be the last." And as we turned into the mist of Baker Street, I could not help but feel that the smile of that antique face would haunt my dreams for many nights to come. The carriage that bore Mrs. Temple Black away disappeared into the fog, its wheels muffled on the damp stones. For a long while Holmes and I walked in silence, the mist curling about us, each lost in thought. At last I ventured that the case was ended, that justice, however sordid, had been achieved. Holmes gave a low laugh, dry and not without irony. "Ended? My dear Watson, a case ends only when all its elements are balanced, when every thread is accounted for. Here one strand still eludes us." I was startled. Temple Black confessed, did she not? Her motive was plain, her means evident, her presence betrayed by scent and note alike. What more is needed? Holmes halted beneath a gas lamp, the glow painting his features in stark shadow. "Confession under duress is no final chord, Watson. It is but a dissonance resolved by convenience. Did you note her words? Better he lie silent beneath your precious relics. That is not the speech of one driven solely by debt. There is a bitterness there, personal, intimate. Temple Black lent Mortlake money, yes, but she also lent him herself. Rejected affections can curdle into venom quicker than unpaid bills. And yet," he tapped his finger against his lip, "there is something too artful in the staging, too neat a theatre. I ask myself whether Mrs. Temple Black was the sole playwright, or merely an eager actress handed a script. The thought unsettled me. Surely you do not mean that another hand guided hers?" Holmes resumed his stride. "I mean precisely that. She possessed poison and purse, but not the imagination to contrive a smiling mask. That was Vale's vanity, true, yet even he seemed startled by the letter's rhetoric, by the theatricality of the affair. Who then stands behind it all? Who had the wit to weave jealousy, debt, and superstition into a single snare? The answer did not come at once, and the fog swallowed us as though guarding its secrets. By the time we reached Baker Street, Holmes was silent once more, pacing the floor with quick strides while I sank, weary, into my chair. He remained thus for the better part of an hour, then abruptly took down his index of clippings from the side table. His long fingers rifled through newspaper paragraphs, society notes, legal proceedings. At last he drew forth a slip, his eyes narrowing. He handed it to me. It was a notice from a fortnight past. Julian Mortlake, barrister, celebrated for his eloquence in court, has lately been observed in company with Miss Ada Penrith, niece of Sir Lionel Charrington. Rumour whispers of an engagement, though no formal announcement has been made. Holmes's voice was soft. Observe the phrasing, Watson. Mortlake celebrated for eloquence and rumour whispers. I have spoken with Mortlake's colleagues. He was talented, yes, but not yet celebrated. Who then supplied this exaggeration to the press? Not a journalist, but one near enough to the family to gild Mortlake's reputation, hoping to propel him into Ada's orbit. And who has such access, such incentive, and such fondness for florid language? The answer dawned upon me with a chill. Lady Eugenia. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Just so. She longed for security through her daughter's marriage, feared ruin from Mortlake's debts, and when cornered, looked to Temple Black as both accomplice and scapegoat. Do you recall her composure when I first spoke of poison? It cracked, but only for a moment. A guilty hand trembles longer, but Temple Black confessed. She confessed to her own bitterness, and indeed she may have provided the poison. But the plan, the rhetoric, the smile, those belonged to Lady Eugenia. Temple Black brewed the draught. Vale painted the mask, but she alone orchestrated the stage upon which Mortlake fell. The chorus of vanity, greed, and jealousy found its conductor in her. Even as he spoke, the bell rang. Jevons stood upon the threshold drenched with rain. He bore a sealed note. Holmes slit it open. The words within were few. "Come. She means to leave tonight." J. Holmes's lips tightened. "Our faithful butler proves watchful. Watson, fetch your coat. The curtain has not yet fallen, and we must be present at its final act." Within half an hour we were once more at Charrington House. The storm had broken, rain lashing the windows. Jevons admitted us silently and led us to the side corridor where trunks stood half-packed. Lady Eugenia herself appeared, cloaked and veiled, her hands trembling as she pressed jewels into a case. At sight of Holmes she froze, composure slipping like a mask too hastily donned. "Going somewhere, madam?" Holmes inquired with chilling politeness. "Abroad, perhaps? Italy, where aconite grows in the fields? Or merely away from a house where the mask no longer smiles as you intended?" She faltered, words failing, then gathered herself. "You cannot prove—" Holmes stepped closer. "I can prove enough. The letter that warned Sir Lionel was penned in your hand, not Temple Black's. The ink, the fibre, the very phrasing are yours. You borrowed her scent to mislead, her poison to kill, Vale's vanity to paint, and Mortlake's folly to cloak your crime. But you, Lady Eugenia, conducted them all." For a moment I thought she would deny it still, but her shoulders sagged. Her voice, when it came, was low, hollow. "He would have ruined us. My daughter's name, our place, all swept away in scandal. I sought only to frighten him, to force retreat. But when Temple Black yielded the draught, it seemed inevitable." Holmes's reply was cold as the rain beyond the window. "Murder is never inevitable, madam. It is chosen." At that, Lestrade, who had followed close behind, stepped forward with his constables. Lady Eugenia raised her chin, proud even in disgrace, and allowed herself to be led away. Ada's cry echoed down the corridor as she emerged to witness her mother's removal, and Sir Lionel bowed his head in silent anguish. Holmes stood motionless, his face unreadable. At last he turned to me, his voice weary. "You see, Watson." The mask smiled not once, but thrice, with Vale's brush, with Temple Black's bitterness, and finally with Eugenia's hand. Each smile concealed a motive, but together they revealed the truth. Vanity may paint, greed may poison, but desperation conducts. We left as dawn crept once more through the storm. The city stirred beneath its veil of rain, oblivious to the tragedy played out behind Charrington's walls. Holmes drew deep upon his pipe as the cab carried us home, and though his words were few, I sensed in him that mingling of triumph and melancholy which follows the unmasking of human frailty. And I, for my part, could not rid myself of the vision of that ancient plaster face, smiling still, though its secret was at last laid bare. The rain had scarcely ceased when we returned to Baker Street, yet Holmes appeared less wearied by the storm than by the moral tempests he had witnessed within Charrington House. He flung aside his soaked coat, sank into his armchair, and lit a pipe with that mechanical precision which always betrayed a mind still ablaze. I poured us both brandy, and for some minutes we sat without speaking, the room filled with the quiet ticking of the clock and the distant rumble of carriages beyond the fog. At length I ventured that the matter at last was finished. Finished? Holmes exhaled a long plume of smoke. Perhaps. The police will have their prisoner, the family their disgrace, and the newspapers their sensation. But for me, Watson, an end is only satisfying when the inner pattern lies bare. This affair, he gestured toward the heap of papers and stained scraps upon his desk, was less a single crime than a fugue, each voice entering with its own note of vanity, greed, or fear. Mortlake's folly provided the theme, Vale painted the counterpoint, Temple Black lent the poison's harsh chord, and Lady Eugenia conducted the whole into a final, fatal cadence. It is rare to see human weakness so harmonized, and rarer still to unravel it before the last bar is struck. I confessed my admiration, though I added that my heart ached for Ada Penrith. She was innocent of all, yet bore the heaviest wound. Holmes nodded gravely. She is the true victim here, more than Mortlake, who courted his own destruction. Ida has lost both suitor and mother in a single night, It is the tragedy of such cases that the innocent suffer most from the sins of the guilty. He leaned forward suddenly, his eyes sharpening. "And yet, Watson, there is one matter still unresolved," I started. "Surely no thread remained untied. You recall the hollow panel beneath the gallery window? The draft that betrayed a hidden space? I have not forgotten it. That detail played no part in the poisoning, nor in the painting of the mask. It lies outside the pattern, and therefore demands attention. A good detective, Watson, is like a physician. He leaves no symptom unexplained, even when the patient appears cured. Despite my weariness, curiosity overcame me. "Shall we return?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Not tonight. The household has endured enough. But tomorrow, with Jevons's assistance, we shall examine that panel. If nothing emerges, we may call the affair complete. If something does, then perhaps Mortlake's death was only the most visible shadow cast by a deeper flame." The following morning found us once more at Charrington House. The gloom of disgrace lingered like a pall. Blinds half drawn, servants subdued, Ada absent from sight. Sir Lionel received us with hollow courtesy and left us to our devices, as though eager to have the weight lifted from his household as quickly as possible. Jevons led us to the gallery and at Holmes's instruction fetched a chisel. Holmes knelt by the skirting where the faint draught had stirred the ash days before. With careful taps he prized loose a narrow panel. Behind it yawned a recess no larger than a writing case. Within lay a packet of letters, tied with faded ribbon, and beside them a small ledger. Holmes withdrew them with reverence, as though touching relics more potent than the antiques surrounding us. He opened the ledger first, scanning its pages with swift precision. It contained names, sums, and dates, records of Mortlake's debts, not merely to Temple Black, but to others of standing in the city, men who would never endure their names in scandal. The letters, when unfolded, revealed Mortlake's florid hand, pledges of love and ambition to various ladies, whose influence he courted, including, Holmes's brow arched, to Lady Eugenia herself. "The web tightens, Watson," he murmured. Mortlake was not merely a debtor, but a blackmailer in embryo. With these papers he could have ruined reputations, coerced marriages, compelled payments. Lady Eugenia feared his exposure, but she was not alone. Half the names here would tremble at their publication. I asked whether Temple Black knew of these papers. Perhaps. More likely, Mortlake hid them here precisely to keep them from her grasp. But someone knew of this hiding place. That explains the draft, the hurried attempt to mislead with shifting curtains, the desperate staging. When Mortlake collapsed, they saw opportunity to take these documents and conceal them again, trusting no one would search. Yet they forgot that a draft, however faint, whispers louder to me than any confession. He replaced the packet carefully and rose. Lestrade must be informed, though he will scarcely thank me for complicating what he deems a concluded case. Still, the court must see that Lady Eugenia's motive was not mere maternal desperation, but the knowledge that Mortlake held her letters, her very honor, in his grasp. Without this discovery, her role might appear almost pitiable. With it, the mask smiles its last and fullest smile. Sir Lionel, when apprised, sank deeper into his melancholy, though he thanked Holmes with a dignity that belied his ruin. The papers, he declared, would be surrendered to the authorities, though he begged that his niece be shielded from further shame. Holmes assured him that Ada's innocence was beyond question, and for once I saw a flicker of warmth pierce the cold reserve of the great detective. As we left, the gallery seemed changed. The mask still hung upon its cord, but now its smile appeared faded, as though shorn of its power. I remarked upon it, and Holmes replied with a rare gentleness, "Objects themselves are innocent, Watson. It is we who lend them expression, our fears, our follies, our crimes." The mask smiled only because men and women around it chose to see a smile. That evening, back at Baker Street, I set my notes in order, already shaping them into the account you now read. Holmes, reclining once more with his pipe, looked out at the fog-wreathed lamps of London. He spoke almost to himself. The mask has ceased to smile, but the city teems with faces far more deceptive. Vanity, greed, desperation, they paint their expressions daily. And so long as men wear such masks, Watson, we shall not lack for work. I raised my glass and he his pipe, and in that moment the case was closed, not by the gavel of a court, but by the quiet understanding between us that truth, once uncovered, demands no further witness. Yet I knew, even as the fire settled to embers, that somewhere in the labyrinth of London, another mask was being prepared, waiting for Holmes to strip it bare. The days that followed brought the inevitable tide of public interest. The newspapers blazoned the affair with their usual flourish, christening it the mystery of the smiling mask. Lestrade, with commendable gravity, gave statements emphasizing the Yard's diligence, though he did not omit a grudging acknowledgement of Holmes's role. Lady Eugenia was committed for trial. Mrs. Temple Black faced charges as an accessory, and Vale was dismissed with censure but no indictment. Sir Lionel retreated from society, and Ada was removed quietly to the countryside, where her health might recover beyond the reach of gossip. For my part, I had scarcely closed my notebook when Holmes tossed aside the final newspaper account and turned back to his violin. He played for an hour without pause, each note drawing out the melancholy that had gathered about him. At last he set the instrument aside and spoke with that curious mixture of detachment and weariness that followed his greatest cases. The world, Watson, adores miracles. A mask that smiles, a death without wound, a household cursed by relics. Such stories delight the imagination. Yet when stripped bare, the truth is never miraculous. It is human, painfully human. Mortlake died not by fate's hand, but by a chain of vanities. Vale's jealous dabbling, Temple Black's bitterness, Eugenia's desperation. Each played their part, but only she drew the strands together. She conducted her orchestra of folly, and the result was murder. I asked whether he felt satisfaction at having exposed her. Satisfaction? Holmes gave a wry smile. It is no triumph to reveal that human nature stoops to folly. The wonder is that it rises at all. Still, the law must have its due, and perhaps in that there is a kind of justice. Yet I confess, Watson, this case has left a sour note. There was no master criminal here, no genius in the shadows, only ordinary weakness draped in melodrama. The mask smiled, but the smile was ours, reflected back at us. I could not help but feel the weight of his words. Indeed, the image of that pale plaster face lingered in my mind, its painted lips fixed forever in mockery. And yet, as I considered Ada Penrith's quiet sorrow, I realized Holmes was right. The true cruelty of the affair lay not in the death of Mortlake, who had sown his own ruin, but in the suffering of the innocent. As the days passed, the city's attention shifted, as it always did, to newer scandals and fresher tragedies. The fog lifted, the lamps burned as before, and life on Baker Street resumed its customary rhythm. Clients came and went, telegrams arrived at all hours, and Holmes, with his mercurial energy, flung himself into fresh studies of tobacco ash, footprints, and the peculiarities of handwriting. Yet there were moments when I caught his gaze resting on the fire, thoughtful and still, as though the smiling mask lingered in his mind as it did in mine. One evening, as we sat together, he broke the silence with a rare note of candor. "You see, Watson, it is not the cases of cleverness that stay with me. It is the ones where ordinary hearts, driven by fear or pride, fashion themselves into instruments of ruin. Those are the cases that remind me why we must keep at our work. For in every street of London, another mask waits to smile." And with that he returned to his violin, drawing out a long, mournful strain that seemed to hang in the very air of Baker Street, fading at last into silence. I closed my notebook, knowing that the tale was complete, and yet convinced that somewhere beyond the window another mystery was already stirring, waiting for Holmes to uncover its face. Thus ended the strange affair of the mask that smiled on its own, an affair that proved once more how even the smallest deception may conceal a crime, and how beneath the masks men and women wear, Holmes alone could discern the true countenance of truth,